Ego and Archetype, Part 5. In successful cases, this can amount to the repair of the ego self axis, which restores contact with the inner sources of strength and acceptance, leaving the patient free to live and grow. Patients with a damaged ego self axis are most impressed in psychotherapy by the discovery that the therapist accepts them. Initially, they cannot believe it. The fact of acceptance may be discredited by considering it only a professional technique having no genuine reality. However, if the acceptance of the therapist can be recognized as a fact, a powerful transference promptly appears. The source of this transference seems to be the projection of the self, especially in its function as the organ of acceptance. At this point, the central characteristics of the therapist's self become prominent. Therapist-self. The therapist as a person becomes the center of the patient's life and thoughts. The therapy sessions become the central points of the week. A center of meaning and order has appeared where previously there was chaos and despair. These phenomena indicate that a repair of the ego self-axis is occurring. Meetings with the therapist will be experienced as a rejuvenating contact with life, which conveys a sense of hope and optimism. At first, such effects require frequent contact and wane quickly between sessions. Gradually, however, the inner aspect of the ego self-axis becomes increasingly prominent. The experience of acceptance not only repairs the ego self-axis, but also reactivates residual ego self-identity. This is bound to occur as long as the ego self-axis is completely unconscious. It's a condition represented by figure 2 down below. Hence, inflated attitudes, possessive expectations, etc., will emerge, which evoke further rejection from therapist or environment. Once again, the ego self-axis will be damaged, producing a condition of relative alienation. Ideally, in psychotherapy and in natural development, one would hope for a progressive dissolution of ego self-identity, so gentle that it would cause no damage to the ego self-axis. Wow. In actuality, this desirable condition scarcely ever occurs. The process of the development of consciousness seems to follow the cyclic course represented in figure 5, page 41, as indicated in. So I'll just pull that up here. Give it a pause. Just pause the frame, have a look at the diagram. So it starts off, I guess, as a child in original wholeness, inflation. It's ego self-identity, active inflation, inflated or heroic act. And then the baseline there, I guess, rejection. So after the rejection becomes the alienation from the self. And the ego, I guess that's when the ego becomes suspended, doesn't know where it is or who it is. Wounding, dismemberment, humility, repentance. Metanoia, it's a sacrificial attitude. Acceptance. Then reconnection with the self. Complaisante, partial return to inflated state. passive inflation. Very interesting. It's page 42. As indicated in the diagram, psychic growth involves a series of inflated or heroic acts. These provoke rejection and are followed by alienation, repentance, restitution, and renewed inflation. This cyclic process repeats itself again and again in the early phases of psychological development, each cycle producing an increment of consciousness. Wow. My whole channel there just explained in one sentence. That's the whole reasoning of me, coming to terms with accepting, the responsibility to try and articulate myself and my experience with ego self-identity and ego self-separation, alienation, and then, discovering the re-acceptance with passive inflation. It's passive inflation. Low battery here. Come on. This cyclic process repeats itself again and again in the early phases of psychological development, each cycle producing an increment of consciousness. Thus, gradually, consciousness is built up. However, the cycle can go wrong. It is subject to disturbances, especially in the early phases of life. In childhood, the child's connection with the self is largely identical with his relation to the parents. Hence, if this relationship is faulty, the child's contact with his inner center of being will likewise be faulty. It is this fact that makes early family relationships so crucially important in personality. I'm reading and processing, how it's applicable, at the same time. Hence, if this relationship is faulty, the child's contact with his inner center of being will likewise be faulty. It is this fact that makes early family relationships so crucially important in personality development. If the interpersonal family relationships are too damaging, the cycle may be almost completely interrupted. It may be interrupted in two places, points A and points B in figure 5. A block can develop if sufficient acceptance and renewal of love does not occur at point A. If the child is not fully accepted after punishment for misbehavior, the growth cycle can be short-circuited. Instead of completing the cycle and reaching the position of rest and reacceptance, the child's ego can be caught in a sterile oscillation between inflation and alienation that builds up more and more frustration and despair. Another place a block can occur is at point B. If the environment of the child is so totally permissive that he has no significant rejection experiences at all, if the parents never say no, that also short-circuits the cycle. The whole experience of alienation, which brings consciousness with it, is omitted, and the child gets acceptance for his inflation. That leads to the spoiled child psychology and contributes to the provisional life in which limitations and rejections have scarcely been experienced at all. Figure 5 represents the alternation between inflation and alienation occurring in the early stages. It leaves out of account the later stage of development when the cycle is superseded. Once the ego has reached a certain level of development, it does not have to continue this repetitious cycle, at least not in the same way. The cycle is then replaced by a more or less conscious dialogue between ego and self. Part 2. Despair and violence. In the state of alienation, the ego is not only disidentified from the self, which is desirable, but is also disconnected from it, which is most undesirable. The connection between ego and self is vitally important to psychic health. The connection between ego and self is vitally important to psychic health. It gives foundation, structure, and security to the ego and also provides energy, interest, meaning, and purpose. When the connection is broken, the result is emptiness, despair, meaninglessness, and in extreme cases, psychosis or suicide. The Bible presents several mythological figures representing the state of alienation. Adam and Eve are sad and estranged figures as they are expelled from the garden. Also, Cain is a figure of alienation. We read in Genesis, "Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?'" End of quote. Yahweh does not seem to realize that it was his own rejection of Cain and his offering that has caused the whole trouble. Cain said to Abel, his brother, "Let us go out of the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done?" "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on earth." Thus, Cain is banished to the wilderness, reenacting on another level Adam's banishment from paradise. If we look at this myth objectively rather than traditionally, we see that the origin of the difficulty was God's rejection of Cain, without apparent cause or reason. We are told that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a tiller of the ground. Perhaps Cain was initiating agriculture in a society of herders. This could amount for Cain's rejection. He was an innovator and suffered the characteristic fate of all who attempt to bring a new orientation to a fixed society that is fearful of change. At any rate, Cain is an archetypal figure representing the experiences of rejection and alienation. His reaction to an excessive and irrational rejection is characteristic, namely violence. Whenever one experiences an unbearable alienation and despair, it is followed by violence. The violence can take either an external or an internal form. In extreme forms, this means either murder or suicide. The crucial point is that at the root of violence of any form lies the experience of alienation, a rejection too severe to be endured. I recall a patient I encountered in a mental hospital who lived out the Cain myth. From earliest childhood, his greatest problem and the central theme of his life experiences was rivalry with his older brother. His brother was successful in everything he put his hand to and was the favorite of both parents. This favoritism was so pronounced that the parents commonly referred to the patient by his brother's name. This, quite understandably, infuriated him, meaning, as it did, that he was not experienced as a separate individual and scarcely existed in their eyes. The patient was left in a state of bitterness and frustration with a sense of utter worthlessness. How identified he was with the rejected one was revealed by his reaction one time while attending a movie, East of Eden, based on the novel by John Steinbeck. This story is a modernized form of the Cain and Abel theme. There are two brothers in the story, one the favorite of the father and the other neglected and rejected. The patient identified powerfully with the rejected brother, and in the midst of the movie he had such an extreme reaction of anxiety and distress that he was forced to leave. Later the patient married, but things did not go well between him and his wife. His wife had an affair with another man. This situation then provoked the old rejection theme in full intensity, and he made a murderous assault on his wife, but did not kill her. Later he attempted suicide. It was unsuccessful the first time, but finally, on his third try, he succeeded. Thus, he lived out his mythological fate to the bitter end. From the inner standpoint, there is very little difference between murder and suicide. The only difference is in the direction in which the destructive energy is moving. In the depressed state, one often encounters murderous dreams. The dreamer murders himself internally. Such dream images indicate that murder and suicide are essentially the same thing symbolically. Another biblical figure, likewise a typical representation of the alienated state, is Ishmael. Ishmael was the illegitimate son of Abraham by the bondwoman Hagar. When Isaac, the legitimate son, was born, Ishmael and his mother were cast out into the desert. The theme of illegitimacy is an aspect of the alienation experience. Actual illegitimate children usually have a severe alienation problem, what might be called an Ishmael complex. Melville's book, Moby Dick, is a beautiful example of the working out of an Ishmael complex. The name of the central character is Ishmael, and the story depicts an alienation between the states of inflation and alienation. The first paragraph of Moby Dick reads, "Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off then I account it high time. I count it high time to get a C as soon as I can. I account it high time to get to C as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or another, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. Everything that happens in the book follows logically from this first paragraph. The whole tragic drama of violence and inflation unfolds out of the initial state of alienated, suicidal despair. It is an example of a short-circuited cycle, a state of alienation that leads back to renewed inflation, having as its consequence still more disaster. Other literary classics also begin with a state of alienation. Dante's Divine Comedy begins with these lines: "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found that I was in a dusky wood. For the right path whence I had strayed was lost." Ah me, how hard a thing it is to tell. The wildness of that rough and savage place, the very thought of which brings back my fear. So bitter was it. Death is a little more so. Goethe's Faust likewise begins in a state of alienation. In the first scene he expresses his emptiness and sterility. Oh, am I still stuck in this jail? This goddamn dreary hole in the wall, where even the lovely light of heaven breaks wanly through the painted panes. Cooped up among these heaps of books, gnawed by worms, coated with dust. Hölderlin expresses the transition from child to adult, as from heaven to wasteland. Blessed be childhood's golden dreams. Their power hid from me life's dismal poverty. All the heart's good seeds, yea, brought to flower, things I could not reach, yea, gave to me. In thy beauty and thy light, O nature, of all effort and compulsion free, fruitful love attained a kingly stature, rich as harvests reaped in Arcady. That which brought me up is dead and riven. Dead the youthful world, which was my shield, and this breast, which used to harbour heaven, dead and dry, as any stubble field. Sorry, I've got to pause here and then I'll continue on with part 5. I'll go over those last couple paragraphs from the literature again. So we'll continue on with part 5. So I'll start again from the literature. Goethe's Faust likewise begins in a state of alienation. In the first scene, he expresses his emptiness and sterility. Oh, am I stuck in this jail? This goddamn dreary hole in the wall, where even the lovely light of heaven breaks wanly through the painted panes, cooped up among these heaps of books, gnawed by worms, coated with dust. Hölderlin expresses the transition from child to adult as from heaven to wasteland. Blessed be childhood's golden dreams, their power hid from me life's dismal poverty. All the heart's good seeds, yea, brought to flower. Things I could not reach, yea, gave to me. In thy beauty and thy light, O nature, of all effort and compulsion free, fruitful love attained a kingly stature, rich as harvests reaped in Arcady. That which brought me up is dead and riven. Dead the youthful world which was my shield, and this breast which used to harbour heaven, dead and dry as any stubble field. That's the end of the quote. We do not lack for modern expressions of the alienated state. In fact, they are so ubiquitous, our time could be well called the age of alienation. Consider, for instance, these passages from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Here is no water, but only rock, rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain, mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand, nor lie, nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry and sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. This powerful poem expresses the individual collective alienation that is characteristic of our time. The heap of broken images surely refers to the traditional religious symbols which for many people have lost their meaning. We live in a desert and cannot find the source of life-giving water. The mountains, originally the place where man met God, have nothing but dry, sterile thunder without rain. Modern existentialism can be considered as symptomatic of the collective alienated state. Many current novels and plays depict lost, meaningless lives. The modern artist seems forced to depict again and again to bring home to all of us the experience of meaninglessness. However, this need not be considered a totally negative phenomenon. Alienation is not a dead end. Hopefully, it can lead to a greater awareness of the heights and depths of life. Part 3. Alienation and the religious experience. Just as the experience of active inflation is a necessary accompaniment of ego development, so the experience of alienation is a necessary prelude to awareness of the self. Kierkegaard, the fountainhead of modern existentialism, recognized the meaning of the alienation experience in this passage. So much is said about wasted lives, but only that man's life is wasted who lived on. So deceived by the joys of life, or by its sorrow, that he never became eternally and decisively conscious of himself and spirit, or, what is the same thing, never became aware and in the deepest sense received an impression for the fact that there is a God, and that he himself exists before God, before this God. which gain of infinity is never attained except through despair. Jung says essentially the same thing in psychological terms. The self, in its efforts at self-realization, reaches out beyond the ego personality on all sides. Because of its all-encompassing nature, it is brighter and darker than the ego, and accordingly confronts it with problems which it would like to avoid. Either one's moral courage fails, or one's insight, or both, until in the end fate decides. You have become the victim of a decision made over your head, or in defiance of the heart. From this, we can see the numinous power of the self, which can hardly be experienced in any other way. For this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. There are numerous descriptions of religious experiences which typically are preceded by what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, what Kierkegaard called despair, and what Jung called defeat of the ego. All these terms refer to the same psychological state of alienation. We find again and again in the documentation of religious experiences a profound sense of depression, guilt, sin, unworthiness, and the complete absence of any sense of transpersonal support or foundation for one's existence to rest upon. The classic symbol for alienation is the image of the wilderness, and it is here characteristically that some manifestation of God is encountered. When the wanderer lost in the desert is about to perish, a source of divine nourishment appears. The Israelites in the wilderness are fed by manna from heaven, Exodus 16:4. Elijah in the wilderness is fed by ravens, Kings 17:2-6. According to the legend, the desert hermit St. Paul was likewise fed by a raven. Psychologically, this means that the experience of the supporting aspect of the archetypal psyche is most likely to occur when the ego has exhausted its own resources and is aware of its essential impotence by itself. Quote, "Man's extremity is God's opportunity." End of quote. William James, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, gives a number of examples of the state of alienation that precedes a numinous experience. One of the cases he discusses is that of Tolstoy. At about the age of 50, Tolstoy relates that he began to have moments of perplexity, of what he calls arrest, as if he knew not how to live or what to do. It is obvious that these were moments in which the excitement and interest which are our functions naturally bring had ceased. Life had been enchanting. It was now flat sober, more than sober, dead. Things were meaningless whose meaning had always been self-evident. The question why and what next began to beseech him more and more frequently. At first it seemed as if such questions must be answerable, and if he could easily find the answers. At first it seemed as if such questions must be answerable, and as if he could easily find the answers, if he would take the time. But as they ever became became more urgent, he perceived that it was like those first discomforts of a sick man, to which he pays but little attention till they run into one continuous suffering. And then he realizes that what he took for a passing disorder means the most momentous thing in the world for him, means his death. These questions, why, wherefore, what for, found no response. I felt, says Tolstoy, that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, and that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. An invincible force impelled me to get rid of my existence in one way or another. It cannot be said exactly that I wished to kill myself, for the force which drew me away from life was fuller, more powerful, more general than any mere desire. It was a force like my old aspiration to live, only it impelled me in the opposite direction. It was an aspiration of my whole being to get out of life. Behold me, then, a man happy and in good health, hiding the rope in order not to hang myself to the rafters of the room where every night I went to sleep alone. Behold me no longer going shooting, lest I should yield to the too easy temptation of putting an end to myself with my gun. I did not know what I wanted. I was afraid of life. I was driven to leave it. And in spite of that, I still hoped something from it. All this took place at a time when, so far as my outer circumstances went, I ought to have been completely happy. I had a good wife who loved me and whom I loved, good children, and a large property which was increasing with no pains taken on my part. I was respected by my kinsfolk and acquaintances than I had ever been. I was loaded with praise by strangers, and without exaggeration, I could believe my name already famous. Without exaggeration, I could believe my name already famous. Moreover, I was neither insane nor ill. On the contrary, I possessed a physical and mental strength which I had rarely met in persons of my age. I could mow as well as the peasants. I could work with my own brain 8 hours uninterruptedly and feel no bad effects. And yet I could give no reasonable meaning to any actions of my life. And I was surprised that I had not understood this from the very beginning. My state of mind was as if some wicked and stupid jest was being played upon me by someone. One can live only so long as one is intoxicated, drunk with life. But when one grows sober, one cannot fail to see that it is all a stupid cheat. What is truest about it is that there is nothing even funny or silly in it. It is cruel and stupid, purely and simply. He is beset with... Sorry, that's the end of the quote. He is beset with unanswerable questions. What will be the outcome of what I do today? Or what shall I do tomorrow? What will be the outcome of all my life? Why should I live? Why should I do anything? Is there in life any purpose which the inevitable death which awaits me does not undo and destroy? These questions are the simplest in the world, from the stupid child to the wisest old man. They are in the soul of every human being. Without an answer to them, it is impossible, as I experienced, for life to go on. That's the end of the quote, or the passage. there is a good example of an acute attack of alienation. This is a good example of an acute attack of alienation. The questions that Tolstoy asks are the same question that lie at the root of every neurosis which develops in the mature years. Hence, Jung can say that he has never seen a patient past the age of 35 who was cured without finding a religious attitude towards life. A religious attitude, understood psychologically, is based on the experience of the numinosum, i.e. the self. But it is impossible for the ego to experience the self as something separate, as long as the ego is unconsciously identified with the self. This explains the need for the alienation experience as a prelude to the religious experience. The ego must first be disidentified from the self before the self can be encountered as the other. As long as one is unconsciously identified with God, he cannot experience his existence. But the process of ego self-separation causes alienation because loss of ego self-identity also involves damage to the ego self-axis. Hence, the typical dark night of the soul that precedes the numinous experience. Another example is John Bunyan's description of his alienated his description of his alienated state as reported by James. We'll start that one in chapter 6. In part 6.